Hi,
Okay.
everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Alicia Seiger. I'm the Managing Director of the Sustainable Finance Initiative at Stanford University and a lecturer at the law school. And I am also a board member at the e-liability Institute. And it is my great pleasure to have Karthik Ramanna and Bob Kaplan joining me today, the original designers of the e-liability algorithm. And we're going to talk about their most recent paper called Principles and Content for Downstream Emissions Disclosures. To give you, for those of you who are auditory learners, to give you the highlights of what that paper investigated and its findings and its applications for businesses and those who are tracking emissions disclosure and accounting. So first, Bob and Karthik, if I can just start with, there were 3 guiding principles that you illuminated in this paper. Can you walk us through what those are?
Sure. And I'm happy to start. Bob, jump in at any point. So the first and most important thing to note about downstream disclosure is that the focus is really on emissions generated at the consumer level. Because in the full adoption of an e-liability system, emissions generated at the level of corporations or governments, any kind of entity that produces e-ledgers, which would be the equivalent of financial statements, those emissions would already be accounted for at some point in the system. The emissions that go unaccounted for, in some sense, are those at the consumer level. So that's sort of the meta framing that, and that's where we focus our efforts on disclosure. With that in mind, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, in principle, universal adoption of the e-liability method would have consumers filing their own statements, and that's where they would get picked up when they drive their cars or heat their homes. But realistically, we don't expect we'll get 8 billion consumers filing their e-liability statements. And so that's a gap, because some companies can have an impact on the emissions that consumers produce when they drive their vehicles or heat their homes or wash and dry their clothes.
Exactly. So, and with that in mind, we have 3 principles, as you alluded to, Alicia. The first is really what I just have already said, which is that downstream accountability is really limited to companies whose outputs are directly used by end consumers. So if you are somewhere else in that value chain, then this is not really a paper or set of principles that apply to you as an entity. The second principle focuses on which of those companies that sell to consumers are accountable for downstream disclosures. And we argue that it's limited to cases where there's a reasonable causal link between the product design decisions that the company makes and the downstream emissions that are incurred by the consumers when they use or dispose of the product. So that's an important distinction there, and we can expand on what we mean by this reasonable causal link. But let me bring in the third principle, Bob, before you come in, just so that we've articulated all 3. And the third principle is basically focusing on what is disclosed. And we say, rather than disclose the total volume of consumer emissions, we want companies in this sense to disclose the emissions per unit of use. And there, the core intuition is that companies can control the emissions per unit of use to a much greater degree than they can control the number of units used. And indeed, you don't want companies to be controlling the number of units used by consumers, certainly not in a free society.
Yeah.
Right. Bob, did you want to come in on something?
Sure. Well, just to summarize the 3 principles in ways that make it actionable is that, going back to internet categories, B2B companies do not have to file downstream disclosures because the emissions associated with the use of their product will be accounted for by the downstream company or the healthcare system or the university or the government agency. So it's only B2C companies, but not all B2C companies. So a company that produced this shirt that I'm wearing, I'm not generating any emissions by putting on the shirt. So they don't have any disclosure associated with the use of their product. So if I'm reading the book, then, or I'm just drinking some beverage that was not refrigerated, then there's no downstream emissions associated with it. So only B2C companies where when consumers use that product, they're generating emissions.
Yeah.
So it's a very restricted set.
Okay, that's helpful. I want to make a point that I'm going to come back to, and then I'm going to ask you to go to examples. But you're talking about accounting. So you're saying the downstream emissions of companies that aren't B2C are accounted for. I do want to come back to accountability. What are they accountable for? But before we get there, can we just go through a couple of examples? So, I think that the triggering examples for most people who've spent a lot of time thinking about GHG emissions are the oil and gas companies or automotive companies or even airlines, which I think is a tricky one. Can you walk through, maybe for each, just quickly, how this would apply to those sectors and those that have been really in the crosshairs of advocacy and sort of trying to drive for change and decarbonization?
Sure.
Yeah.
So let me pick
Well,
up
we
with
could-
the oil companies first, and then Bob jump in at any point. Because the oil companies are really where a lot of emotions lie, as you point out, Alicia. So for oil companies, obviously the emissions associated with the exploration, the extraction, the refining, the mining, et cetera, those emissions are part of incurred cradle-to-gate emissions for the oil company, and those would be accounted for on the e-ledger of the oil company. When the oil company in turn settles the oil to, say, a energy provider, this might be like a company that produces electricity from fossil fuels, then effectively that incurred cradle-to-gate emissions will be transferred onto the ledger of the fossil fuel provider. And when the fossil fuel provider actually combusts the fossil fuel to produce heat energy, which is then used to convert it into electrical energy, that fossil fuel company is now, sorry, that energy provider, that electricity company is now responsible for those direct emissions, and that will become part of their e-ledger. And then when they sell on to consumers, they're selling a product, in this case, electricity, which, to Bob's earlier point, on use by the consumer generates no further emissions. So all of the incurred cradle-to-gate emissions are accounted for in that value chain at the level of corporations. In this context, the substance of those emissions would be accounted for by the electricity generator, the company that's producing the electricity. Well, in turn, for instance, that electricity company is selling its electricity to a third-party manufacturer. And that manufacturer, say, makes things like automobiles, to your earlier example. Then again, the electricity and the incurred cradle-to-gate emissions associated with that electricity will make it onto the e-ledger of that manufacturer. And that manufacturer will then sort of incorporate that into the product level emissions associated with its product. In this case, it would be a car, but it could be a washing machine or something like that. And we can talk about, use emissions in a moment, consumer use emissions associated with cars and washing machines. But that's how that accounting would work. Effectively, the only case where this really matters for fossil fuel, these principles of downstream emissions disclosures really matter for fossil fuel companies, is when these fossil fuel companies sell their products directly to consumers. So this would be effectively for use of personal use of automobiles, as well as for home heating, right? So in these two cases, it is the end consumer that is burning the fossil fuel. And here too, again, we would argue that what the fossil fuel company cannot control is the volume of use. You can't control whether the consumer is going to heat their home to 75 degrees in the winter or to 70 degrees or to 65 degrees. So you can't control the volume of use by the consumer, but you can certainly control the emissions per unit of use. And that's what they would be held to a disclosure standard on. Let me pause there and see if Bob wants to come in on any of this, and then we can pick up on the automobile example.
Well, I mean, the automobile is the one, in effect, that if particularly the car manufacturer has designed the car so that it's more fuel efficient, then the quantity of combustion per kilometer driven is lower, and that's a good incentive, and that's why it's worth having that disclosure and to have some competition. among the automobile designers to lower the rate at which consumers generate emissions per unit of use. And it could be per kilometer driven or per temperature of heat that I am heating my home to, or cooling it in the summer, which is also, could be generating some of that. Yeah. So, but
I was going to ask a question, but I don't want to interrupt you, Bob. Did you have another?
no, go ahead.
Well, Karthik, you ended your comment about oil and gas with a disclosure standard for direct to consumer, and I just want to highlight some terminology that I think gets conflated often in these conversations. So companies can be held accountable to a disclosure standard. There is a difference, and maybe you can help our audience understand, between accounting and disclosure and accounting and accountability. So what, can you tease out sort of what's accounting and what's disclosure in the context of these examples? And then if I can ask a compound question, how that then translates into accountability? What are the mechanisms for accountability? Because at the end of the day, right, these exercises are in pursuit of decarbonization. Hopefully the end goal is that individuals are not burning as much fossil fuels in their transportation, and that companies have fewer embodied emissions or are burning, less fossil fuel in their business activities. So can you connect all those dots for us?
Sure. Those are really, really important dots to connect. So let me offer a framework on that, and then I think the first and most important thing to lay out here is what is the problem we're trying to solve with the e-ledger system, with e-liabilities and e-assets. And the problem we are trying to solve is, how do we robustly count the moles or molecules of CO2 that are put out into the atmosphere from commercial activity? And that's on the e-liability side. And how do we then robustly count the moles or molecules of CO2 that are indefinitely sequestered? That's the problem we're trying to solve, which is a very, very limited problem. It's a very tightly defined problem, but it's a very important problem, probably one of the most important problems that we've faced as a species to date. But that's the specific nature of the problem. And the beauty of that problem, although it has many complexities to it, is that it lends itself beautifully to solving through accounting. Not all problems can be solved through accounting. Then you might have more complex problems that cannot be solved through accounting. So this is where, therefore, the distinction between accounting and disclosure becomes really important. So accounting is basically a body of knowledge or state of practice that has certain properties. For instance, the information produced in accounting statements are mutually exclusive across entities. Within a jurisdiction, they will be collectively exhaustive to the performance of that jurisdiction. They will be comparable across entities in that jurisdiction. They will be consistent across time. They will be accurate, they will be reliable, and most importantly, they will be representationally faithful. And what we mean by that, again, all of these are very specific terms that have come to assume very specific meanings in the context of accounting. By representationally faithful, we mean that the numbers that are produced in these accounting statements actually do represent the underlying phenomenon that they are trying to measure, which is different when you try put, say, a disclosure estimate on it, because at best you can say on a disclosure estimate, it's not obviously wrong. But you can't say with a disclosure estimate that it is within, in using accounting parlance, it is within a non-material margin of error of the true underlying phenomenon that we're trying to measure here. So that's sort of important in terms of understanding the distinction between accounting and disclosure. And this very specific tight problem that we are trying to focus on, which is counting moles of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere from economic activity and counting indefinite sequestration of these moles of CO2, that problem lends itself beautifully to accounting. And of course, it's not just accounting for accounting's sake. That would not be very useful. We're not doing this because this is some sort of Renaissance high art. We're doing this because in the process of accounting for something, you are able to provide dynamic real-time data to decision makers to drive decarbonization, to your important point. It's also really important in the context of accounting because of those properties of comparability and reliability and representational faithfulness that I mentioned earlier, that the data that is produced in this system is robust. So in the world of financial accounting, we've come to see generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, almost as this sort of God-given, intrinsic body of knowledge that we've always had. But the term GAAP was never used until 1935. And before 1935, there was no such thing. People just defined whatever they want as an asset, and they defined whatever they want as a liability and revenue and so forth. And then, of course, that resulted in the exuberance of the 1920s and the great stock market crash of 29. And then, a remarkable group, actually, was something like 17 to 20 people. They were academics. They were some people from public service, some people from companies that got together, and they defined a set of principles that provided the first iteration of what we currently call GAAP, right? And so that accounting basis, that rigor, now provides, in some sense, the rails, the guardrails on which all of the disclosure that we see in the financial ecosystem, the financial markets ecosystem, all of that disclosure basically comes to rest on that bedrock of accounting. So in that same sense, there is a part of this problem associated with the management of climate change that lends itself to this specific discipline of accounting, where it can be robustly measured, which is what the problem that e-liabilities and e-ledgers are designed to solve. Upon that basis can rest a whole host of disclosure paradigms to satisfy all kinds of objectives that you might have. So early on in this process, we had taken this idea to some people who are very close to the WRI, which is an organization that is the parent entity of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And we had said, why don't you build this system out? We've given you the algorithm. We're happy for you to use it to build it out. And their response was, well, the problem we're trying to solve is different. The problem we're trying to solve is excess consumerism in society. I said, that's a really important problem for some people, and more power to you, but that's not the problem that this e-ledger system is designed to solve. It's designed to just to count moles of CO2. And that's where this distinction matters.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
So let me implicit in what Karthik just described, and he used the word system often, and accounting. And by having all organizations on the same accounting system, you can depend upon everyone following the same rules. In particular, for a company, when it says, this is my cost of goods sold, and a key component of that is the cost of the materials that I purchased. Well, how do we know that? Well, because the auditors can go to the suppliers, the tier 1 suppliers, and said, this company claims they purchased this amount from you at this price. Do you concur? And they say yes, because they're in the system. And they're measuring that, and their auditors can verify that. And the auditor of the company can also say to the customer and says, this company claims some revenue that they sold these products to you at this price. Can you confirm that? And everyone's used, because they're all on the same system. This is now, you're that company, that your customer's supplier. And so the beauty of having everybody on the system is that you can rely on valid, auditable information being transferred from stage to stage. And when you do that, it's much simpler, because you only have to look to your immediate suppliers, and they comply. They don't say, well, go somewhere else. This protocol says I don't have to talk to you. No, you're part of the system, and you have to supply and validate the information being asked. And the same thing with the customers. When I ask, did you have a sale from this company? Do you have an accounts receivable that you expect to pay this company? And then they will reply back, yes. So it makes the whole system objective, representative, faithful, as Karthik said, and auditable. And that's the beauty of the e-ledger system, is to take advantage of having all organizations, reporting on the emissions that they purchase from their immediate suppliers, and most importantly, have accountability for transmitting when they add their scope 1 emissions to the production of their products and services when they sell it to a customer, sending that customer information not only on the price and the delivery, but also the carbon content of the product and service that the customer purchased.
Yeah, great. I think those are two really important points that I hope people are paying close attention to, this idea of the history of the accounting system and what we now take for granted, and how that really took the country and the globe out of a tailspin after the Great Depression and the big stock market crash. And then, Bob, your point about the system. I want to come back to double counting, which is a triggering term too. I think in the parlance of the protocol, it's actually a feature, right? And here, one of the benefits of the liability algorithm is that it avoids this what we call actually indeterminate overcounting. It's not just double counting. But when it comes to downstream emissions, it of course matters where you're standing and where you're looking, because as you've described, there's the downstream B2C, but there's downstream throughout the supply chain. And one of the challenges with protocol is that there is this indeterminate overcounting as goods and services move upstream, downstream. So can you walk us through kind of how you think about this indeterminate overcounting of disclosure versus how that plays out in an accounting system?
Yeah, and it's exactly the point that I was just making, because in accounting, the cost of material is measured just once where it's measured, where it occurred, but then that information is transferred all the way downstream. So you can get to the cost of a kilogram of iron ore, that's measured at the mining company, and that information now gets embedded in the cost of a Toyota or an Airbus, because that information is transmitted all the way up, and everybody is accountable for it and trying to reduce their materials costs, but it's only counted once. It's counted where it occurred, at the origin, of that cost. And in our case, where the Scope 1 emission occurred. But all the companies downstream are accountable for that because they're inheriting that information as it passes from stage to stage. So you have multiple accountability, which is really powerful. Every entity in that whole value chain is trying to reduce its purchased emissions and putting pressure on its suppliers. But the Scope 1 emissions is measured only once. It's measured at the origin and where it occurred, and then it's passed downstream. Whereas in the greenhouse gas protocol, so BMW has to estimate the emissions from all its suppliers. So it goes to one of its suppliers, say Bosch, and says, Bosch, you have to tell us your emissions you're sending to us. And Bosch says, yeah, but I got to check with all, and then Bosch has to do the same calculation with all of its suppliers. So it's not only multiple counting, it's multiple accounting. Each entity is replicating the same accounting process, particularly when they think about the downstream. So there's massive overcounting and bureaucratic burden on every company. Whereas, when everyone's on the system that we just described, it's done once, only once. It could be audited there, true and fair, faithfully representative, as Karthik was saying. But there's multiple accountability.
Yeah, can I pick up on that? Karthik, I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah, so that, and maybe this will address some of what you're trying to say here, Alicia. Look, if you want to be sort of generous to the way the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has approached this, I'd say that the value that they perhaps see in the multiple counting is that it overstates the nature of the problem. And because at the time when they conceived these standards, they were intended to be purely voluntary from few companies, and they really wanted to raise the salience of the problem, there was some sort of value to this performative aspect to it, which is, let us say that the emissions associated from this product are 20 or 30 times more than they might be, because then that brings some attention to it. That would be perhaps, again, it's a performative element, and it would be something that for disclosure purposes, you could say, okay, reasonable under the circumstances in the context, et cetera. As someone who we've engaged with on e-liabilities pointed out to me, I think perhaps the great challenge then for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is that they have on size 40 font, on their standard corporate value chain accounting. So if it's corporate value chain accounting, then the idea that you would have multiple counting makes no sense, right? If this was sort of corporate value chain performative disclosure, then, of course, you can design it any which way you want. But that's why I said the term accounting has a very specific meaning, and there. The idea is that companies, and this is really an important point for our downstream paper, is that companies can control what happens upstream, right? In the sense of they can control it through their purchasing decisions. They can make a decision about who to buy for. They can make production choices about which types of materials to use, what type of energy to consume, where to locate their business, etc. So those are within the realm of companies' control. And that's where, the e-ledger system will say, okay, therefore you inherit the emissions associated in those. But what happens downstream from a company is much harder for a company to control. Now, what a company can control, as we've said earlier, is emissions per unit of use. But what they cannot control is this notion of how much is used. And that's why we make that distinction. And of course, in the e-ledger system, you don't need to have the multiple counting downstream, because as long as you're selling to other companies, they're going to produce their own e-ledgers, and that information gets robustly counted in the system.
Yeah. Just to be explicit about this rate of use by consumers, a car company, BMW or Toyota, can estimate what the energy consumption is per kilometer of driving. But I learned how to drive in Boston. I'm kind of an aggressive driver. I accelerate quickly from a stop, and I brake hard, and I drive maybe over the speed limit occasionally. And so my rate of use is actually higher per kilometer driven just because of the way I drive. Whereas other people that I drive with, much more conservative. And so certainly the car companies can't control that. I guess now they can start to monitor that with electronics that are put in there. But certainly the fossil fuel companies don't control that, based, the fact that you're getting lower gas mileage, or you're burning up more of the energy stored in your battery as you drive per kilometer than the average one. So getting back to the disclosure versus accounting, the accounting is based on actual performance, actual historical data. And as you can see in this driving example, a lot of the data that we will try to get companies to disclose is based on, rough estimates, big averages, the average driver, the average driving conditions, the average energy efficiency of a boiler that's heating a home, but not the actual experience that's really being incurred. And so the accounting, what makes it powerful for all the companies and all the B2B suppliers is it's really going to be based on actual performance. The way they actually built the product and processed it, the actual transportation that was used to move it from one place to the other, not on emissions factors that are broad estimates.
Right. No, that's leading exactly to where I want to go. I just have a couple more questions. I want to get to collaboration and competition, and then also timing. But as you just both articulated, in the car example, for example, disclosure on an emissions per kilometer basis can be useful. But when you're talking about accounting, what you're delivering now is an algorithm for those automobile manufacturers to know the embodied emissions in that vehicle when it rolls off the lot, which right now is not information that is available or useful.
And could be in the car sticker, and actually for every consumer product, even the shirt, even though it doesn't generate emissions in use, I could have a label that says how many kilograms of carbon were emitted in the atmosphere to get this shirt or this book I'm about to read.
Right. And so, and I want to come back to your comment, Bobby, multiple accountability as opposed to indeterminate overcounting of emissions. And when you're into multiple accountability, this is where I want to get into collaboration and competition. I mean, obviously, the goal here, again, is decarbonization and decarbonization of supply chains so that there are fewer emissions embodied in the products and services that are being transacted throughout the world. And so can you give us an example of how e-liability accounting has fostered and enabled competition for decarbonization? And I know we're talking about downstream here, but again, it depends on where you stand. So, that could affect downstream, downstream emissions of where that competition is taking place. But can you give us a little insight there?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, and I just finished a playbook on climate governance standard setting, which is at climategovernanceplaybook.com. And one of the reasons I wrote that playbook is many of the corporate climate standards that are out there were built very much for a voluntary world. They were built for a world where you had a few committed players that were basically making some heroic estimates, but with a view, again, to what we said earlier, raising the salience of the issue. As the salience of the issue has now been raised and it's become, something that regulators are considering, it's become something that's become part of international treaties and so forth. It's important we recognize that we don't build systems assuming that everyone's going to do the right thing all the time. That's just not how the world works. And in fact, one of the points about the e-ledger, the e-liability system, is that it harnesses that most intrinsic or basest instinct of companies, which is to compete. It harnesses that to solve this problem of or address this problem associated with climate change. So
Yeah.
in that context, what we really want is for companies to be able to distinguish their performance on in terms of the moles of CO2 associated with decisions that were under their control, right? And then to use that performance distinctiveness as a way to win more business from their, say, B2B customers, or eventually from their B2C consumers, if that's whom they're selling to. So competition is very much at the heart of this. So when we say multiple accountability, we don't mean it in the same way that it was originally construed in, say, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, where, various companies would all be accountable for the same number and say, we will share our responsibility for this. That's not what we mean. We mean multiple accountability in the sense of companies downstream from a value chain are accountable for the decisions that their upstream suppliers made by virtue of that purchasing. And if they made different purchasing decisions, they wouldn't be accountable for it, right? So that's, in that sense, they're able to distinguish themselves from their competitors. And I think that is worth highlighting.
So let's take a specific example of this, and it's based on a paper that actually Karthik co-authored, which was work we did with a energy company, but make electrical transformers, that go into power stations or even in corporate generating power. And the critical ingredient was copper, the copper wire, lots of copper they're being used. And they're under tremendous pressure from environmental community to dramatically increase their use of recycled copper and stop mining copper because that was dirty. And the engineer said, well, actually, I don't think all of our copper mined is that dirty. And so they did the study, and Karthik supervised it. And they found in their mine in northern Sweden, where they got a bunch of their copper from, it was a very efficient mine. It was rich loads. You got a lot of copper ore per shovel full that you pulled out. It was a completely electrified mine, and the electricity came from hydropower in northern Sweden. So it was really efficient, and they could trace that through 4 levels of suppliers until it got to the company that was making transformers. And they said, well, let's do the same thing for recycled copper. And it turns out to get recycled copper, you have to incinerate printed circuit boards. And gee, that generates a bunch of scope 1 emissions. And they did the same calculations, and the copper produced from recycled copper was 3x emissions per ton than from the northern Sweden mine. But that was, even those 2 sources, they saw how to get a 3rd source. And so they can go to a hypothetical mining company in a country in the west of South America. Chile has lots of copper. And that's really it was an old mine. It's, you got only a few copper kilograms per big shovel full. It was fossil fuel, and you had the transportation cost of moving the copper from Chile to Northern Europe, where the production was. Well, that emissions per ton of copper was 3 times the recycled copper. So here was what had been a commodity. How do you compete on commodity? Well, it's price, price, and price, maybe delivery. Well, now you have new forms of competition. Not just the functionality. The copper is the copper by the time it shows up in the factory and they use it, but and it's not just price and delivery. It's now how much emissions were produced to get the copper wire to us to put into our transformers. And then there was an order of magnitude difference between the copper coming from, say, Chile versus the copper coming from the mine, and the recycled is in the middle. We've never seen that before.
Yeah.
You can't have an emissions factor for copper. And there's all these systems
Right.
all over the world now that says, if you use copper, we have an emissions factor. It's in our database. We'll give you the system so you can calculate it. Now there's an order of magnitude difference about the
Yeah.
sourcing and the transportation of copper. And so that's what you get. And that's why you need this accurate, that's the competition. So now this
Right.
electrical company, transformer company, which sells to a utility, and utility is interested in lowering its emissions because that'll lower its so-called scope 2 emissions to its customers. If they can purchase capital equipment with lower content, then they have a lower emissions per kilowatt of electricity. Okay,
Yeah.
so now they're interested. Okay, so now we want to source from you, company, because we can see that your capital equipment produce lower emissions in its production than the other. So now we have competition going on in what previously had been a completely commoditized market. And so that's really, it's exciting, but getting back to what Karthik said, it's also important because it's going to be fewer moles of CO2 going in the atmosphere when we source copper locally from very efficient mines rather than from inefficient mines located thousands of kilometers from us, or unnecessarily incinerate printed circuit boards for copper that we could get, with less emissions from going to very efficient mines.
Right. I love that example, Bob. Thank you for sharing it. I mean, to me, it really highlights so many key benefits of the e-liability algorithm. It shows that this can work in a voluntary context before it's regulated. It shows that it drives competition. It shows that there's accountability upstream and downstream. So this idea that e-liabilities is just passing emissions downstream with no accountability, it shows how that actually is not the case in practice. It gives the necessary information for capital allocation decision-making. I love that example.
So Karthik, it was your paper. What did I leave out?
No, I think with the exception of some of the numbers, which I will direct people to the actual paper to look at it because we had to camouflage it to protect the company's competitively sensitive information. I think the key point is just that, which you can turn a commodity into a basis for competitive differentiation. And it again highlights the point that we made earlier that the e-liability system and the e-ledger system is designed to solve a very specific problem, which is to count the moles of CO2 that are going into the atmosphere and the moles that are being indefinitely sequestered. That is the problem that needs to be solved, not all the other things that are layered onto it. Of course, those are important, but once you conflate those, then you end up with a system that might end up doing nothing.
So I want to ask a question about liabilities. We using the term e-liabilities. Liabilities mean different things to different people. They're financial liabilities, they're legal liabilities. Can you help us understand the context, liabilities in this context as they relate to other forms of liabilities?
Yeah. So when we say e-liability, we refer to an accounting liability. So effectively, the liability is that the one that the company has assumed by virtue of putting out a mole of CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's a liability against, in some sense, Mother Nature. So that's what we mean by that. Now, whether that accounting liability translates into an legal liability is a matter well beyond the accounting system and what it is we're trying to do. We certainly have gotten a fair bit of feedback from some players in this space that can you not use a different term other than e-liability? So we could think about e-ledger as the broader term, which then sort of subsumes assets and liabilities in an accounting sense. Quite frankly, both Bob and I being sort of, from sort of this more quantitative accounting rigorous background, didn't spend much time thinking about the marketing elements of this. But one of our staunch defenders, who's actually a senior corporate executive, who actually likes the term liability, said to a group of his peers when they were criticizing us on the term, "I can't believe that you guys are worried about what color the t-shirt is when the problem here is solving climate change."
Right.
So
Right.
leave it at
But-
that.
But it is, I mean, accounting liability is the right-hand side of a balance sheet where assets are on the left and liabilities are on the right, and that's all we intended it to be. And the fact that you owe a supplier some money or your employee some money in the next paycheck has nothing to do with any legal liability. It's just a term of art that has come into well-established use.
Right. Thank you. That's helpful. All right. I want to turn maybe to our last question here, which is that, getting back to the original algorithm, there was the first paper in HBR, which won the HBR McKinsey Idea of the Year award. You've had a few subsequent papers, but why now? Why did you wait until now to write this paper on downstream emissions?
That's a great question. I think most importantly, because when we wrote the liability paper, we were seeing it as an accounting system, very much along the lines of what we've talked about in this call. But we got a lot of criticism about, but what about downstream? And you're letting, the fossil fuel companies off the hook, and you're not considering, emissions at the consumer level and so forth. So we listened to that and said, is there really a problem here that the e-liability system has not solved? And in principle, there isn't, because as Bob mentioned earlier, if everybody in the system, including the consumer, produces their e-ledger, then the problem has been addressed. Of course, in practice, consumers are not going to produce e-ledgers or anytime soon anyway, in which case there can be some corporate disclosure at that level, but again, in the very limited sense in which we've defined it, because that will help bring more clarity to this problem. But importantly, a large part of the disclosure ecosystem in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is about B2B disclosure downstream, all that is obviated under the e-liability system if the problem you want to solve is that of counting moles of CO2. If you have, I will add, different problems that you want to solve. For instance, someone in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol once said to me, well, it's important to us that we make oil companies look evil. Now, if that's an objective function, then of course you will design a different system. That's not the problem we've set out to solve. I think what we want to do is to encourage economic activity to be free of CO2 emissions, which is very different from saying encouraging economic activity that is free of the use of fossil fuels. As my colleague Miles Allen has pointed out, that's a very important distinction to make, both from the perspective of where we source our energy from, but also for our purposes from the perspective of how we count what we do.
So just my short answer, getting back to your question of why now, is basically Karthik, I looked and we immediately recognized that the measurability and accountability for upstream emissions was completely different from downstream emissions. One, for the reasons we've talked about. And we looked at downstream emissions and we said, there's no way that a mining company is going to be able to report on the emissions that it's or produced, in an Airbus or a BMW or a Toyota. I mean, that's just fanciful to think that they have any idea what that could be. So we just put it aside because we knew we could solve the upstream problem using the e-liability method. And so, we're both, even though we're accountants now, we used to be engineers, and we say we don't want the best to be the enemy of the good. And so we had a good solution. Let's focus that and report on that and defer to later to think about the downstream emissions. And, since the first article appeared in 2021, we've had more chance to think about it and hear people who care passionately about downstream emissions make their case to us. And we learned from them. We learned from a consumer packaged good company, that for a rice product they were producing, they could pre-cook the rice so the consumer only needed 5 minutes to heat it up rather than 10 or 20 minutes to heat it up. And that saved emissions. We said, that sounds sensible. Okay. So we filed it away. We heard another consumer packaged good company said, we've changed the recipe for functionality of our detergent so consumers can wash their clothes in cold water and get it just as clean as washing it in hot water. And there's much less emissions. You don't have to heat up the water. So, okay, yeah, that's reasonable. That's a good point. And we had makers of phones or game consoles say, we've been able to design this so people can play it and use, less electricity, when they're using it. So we were hearing all these examples, and then we had, okay, now let's come up with a framework that captures this and gives them credit, when they're doing these good things that enable the consumers to get the full functionality of the product while producing fewer emissions. And so and when we had enough of these, okay, we're ready to write the paper and deal with that. And that's how it came up. That's really the evolution here. And we're not going back on anything we said in the first paper. First paper is right. It's about upstream emissions, setting up an accounting system from origin up to the shipping dock of a company and measure the total emissions involved in every product they ship. And you could put it on every invoice you send a customer. And that was all in the first paper. And now we have, we had the idea, we know which companies are going to be accountable for the downstream. And it's not all companies. It's only the companies really with a consumer, you can recognize the name of the company. And so it's not the car dealer that has the downstream emissions. They're just an intermediary, between the BMWs and Toyotas and the consumer. The name on the vehicle is they're the ones who are accountable for it. And the company that pre-cooked the rice, their name's on the package, and we can recognize that they have that accountability for the energy when the consumer uses that product. It's not the retailer that sold the product. Retailer had no influence on that emissions. So, but all those ideas were able to come together in this paper.
Yeah, great. Well, and if I can paraphrase both of your responses, dare I, in my own words, I would say maybe that the work you did initially and continue to do is accounting, and over time the evolution here, or the opportunity here, was to intersect accounting principles with disclosure, because there are a lot of people thinking about disclosure and really wanting to improve downstream disclosure, and so this work applies accounting principles to disclosure in appropriate and efficacious ways. And Karthik, I want to come back to your comment about what's the goal, and clarifying that at least in my view, there's still a goal of an economy that operates with much less fossil fuels than today, perhaps not zero, and that it will be a long time before we get to that place. But it comes to this question of a theory of change, of whether a disclosure is an effective tool for decarbonizing global supply chains and to dramatically reduce the use of fossil fuels in our economic systems. And the theory of change has been a naming and shaming exercise of tagging companies with as many emissions as possible. And what accounting enables is actionable, auditable, information that can help change capital allocation decisions, so that decarbonization moves through global supply chains through aligned incentives and auditable information, as opposed to a naming and shaming kind of exercise.
That's a really important point, and I think one worth us highlighting here toward the end, which is the e-liability e-ledger system is policy and technology neutral. It's policy and technology agnostic, right? So what, again, we're doing is counting moles of CO2 that go into the atmosphere. Obviously, if you use fossil fuels without any effort to engage in removal offsets, then that's going to, under the e-ledger system, rack up your balance of liabilities. Boom. So that's just going to be part of the, but at the same time, if you use fossil fuels, but for every mole of CO2 that you put out into the atmosphere from burning them, you are indefinitely sequestering them through, say, some sort of CCS technology that is radically lower in cost than it is today, then the e-ledger system would count that. And so that's why I say it's policy agnostic and it's technology agnostic. And that's really important for an accounting system, right? And in fact, part of the challenge we get with bad policy is when you design an accounting system to skew toward a policy, because then that policy can never be held accountable. We see this a lot with, say, the way governments have put their finger on the thumb of EVs, right? What we don't know today is whether that is the winning technology versus, say, hybrid or hydrogen or some sort of CCS technology based on fossil fuels, et cetera. And the point is, rather than take a view on the policy or the technology, the accounting here, where we're talking about, is agnostic to that. And that then drives better policy making.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Did
Fully
you have
agree.
anything else you wanted to
Yeah,
add?
there's one other point, and this really became apparent to me in an article which will be published shortly in the Harvard Business Review of our pilot with a building materials company. And it's this idea that the greenhouse gas protocol has companies looking in the wrong direction. Right now, because of the difficulty of getting emissions from your purchased products and services, all the focus is on suppliers and how do we get more information from your suppliers. In the accounting system that Karthik and I have described, you automatically get that information from your suppliers. The important thing is to look to your customers. And we have to shift the accountability from thinking about your suppliers to thinking about you have accountability and you have to provide information to your customers. And so the case in point, was for this building materials company, its biggest carbon input was some plastic stuff they bought from large energy companies. And they went to, one its largest energy company, petroleum company that was making the plastic, and says, look, you have 5 plants in Europe, and we need to know, which plant are you shipping us from, and what is the characteristics of the product. And basically, the company said, get lost. We don't have to tell you that. Just use the average emissions factor for this resin. All right. And they just couldn't get that information. And that made their own calculations less accurate. And so we have to shift the focus that, you don't have any accountability to your customers. It's no, that's all of where your accountability is. It's really important that you supply each of your customers with the actual emissions, based on the plant that it was produced and the technology that was used and the transportation that was used to move it, from your plant to your customer's plant. And so if we can just, shift the focus and think that each company is accountable to its customers, then the whole system works a lot better than it's working now.
That's great. And an important point to end on. And so with that, please join me virtually in thanking Karthik and Bob for their time today, for their helpful insights. And we look forward to continuing to share content in this form and to engaging with you all in these important questions and conversations.
Thank you, Alicia. And do read the full paper to our viewers, because there's a lot of information in there that expands on what we've said. So you can find it on SSRN and coming out in Harvard Business Review in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you.